This past week, Pope Francis made a statement regarding civil unions for same-sex couples, their right to a family, and their right to be part of the family. So many people have had questions for me about this because it has made front page of many, many newspapers, and people are discussing, has there been a change in the church's teaching regarding homosexual relations? Now let me begin by saying this. I understand, I've been a priest 45 years, what a sensitive topic this may be, especially for someone who has a homosexual inclination or families that have members who are homosexuals. I am speaking in the context of the gospel today. Love your neighbor as yourself. I'll explain a little bit more what that means as we go on in discussing the Pope's statement. First of all, people don't seem to realize, and rightly so, I'm not blaming anyone for not knowing this. Sometimes people think that whenever the Pope speaks, it is an official pronouncement of the church. And that's not true. It's not true. He speaks in many registers, if you will. And so there is the ordinary teaching of the church, which is the church's belief based on scripture and tradition, which we have believed for 2,000 plus years. Then there is the extraordinary magisterium when the Pope speaks infallibly on an issue. And infallibly requires that he says, I declare, I proclaim, I define. And even when he speaks in those words, what he says must be based on scripture and tradition. In other words, a pope cannot make up something new simply because, well, it's politically correct. Now, what about this statement that the Pope made? It holds no theological weight. No theological weight. It is his personal opinion. It's part of a conversation that he had while making a movie about him called Franciscus. And so he gave forth this opinion that we should support civil unions, that homosexual persons have a right to a family, and that homosexual persons are part of the family. So there is no change in the church's teaching. Anybody that says anything otherwise, they don't know what they're talking about, or it's simply wishful thinking. Now, what does the church teach regarding homosexuality? First of all, we have to go to Scripture. And there are in Scripture prohibitions in Scripture. So it's not something that we just decided to make up based on culture. We can go to Genesis and Leviticus and find those prohibitions. We can also go to the New Testament, St. Paul, 1 Corinthians, Romans, and Timothy, where we find prohibitions against same-sex behavior. From there, we go to the constant tradition of the church, the constant teaching of the church. And where do we find that? In the Catechism of the Catholic Church. I have, over the years, encouraged you to get a copy of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. This tells us what we must believe as Catholics. And so there are two sections in there that I hope you'll go home and take a look at, or at least go online and take a look at what it says. 2357, talking about homosexuality as a disorder and something that cannot be acceptable for human beings, good human behavior. The second, 2358, talks about the church's relationship with homosexual persons. And here it says, although we have those prohibitions, that to engage in some homosexual act is a mortal sin, contrary to God's law and contrary to nature, what the church has always counseled is this: that homosexual persons be treated with dignity and respect. That is the constant teaching of the church. If you go to the Catechism, you'll see it there, and it might even flesh it out a little bit more for you, because time doesn't allow me to go further into how we are to enact that in our personal lives and in our ecclesiastical life. Now, when the Pope encourages civil unions, that becomes extremely questionable. Because if the law, civil law, begins to, and we already have, make laws promoting or allowing for civil unions, and then the church says it's okay, what's the problem with that? The problem is we are giving approval to sinful behavior. And because homosexual relations are sinful behavior, a homosexual relationship endangers the immortal soul. It is mortal sin. Now, many people don't talk about sin anymore, but that's what it is. It's a disordered way of acting. And therefore, it's against Scripture, tradition, and the natural law. So for us to say that we should allow or encourage civil unions would be to give somewhat of an approval to a situation which will lead to mortal sin for those who are involved. And therefore it jeopardizes their immortal soul. Therefore, we cannot encourage civil unions. When the Pope talks about the right to a family, once again, the right to a family is based on Scripture. It is the relationship between a man and a woman. And we know that that is the best way to raise a child. And once we begin to say, well, you don't need the nuclear family anymore, then we're beginning to say that we can reconstruct the family any way we want. And what then is our position regarding what is good for a child? What's the best situation for a child to be raised in? Now, what about those of us who perhaps have a family member who is a homosexual, male or female? Right? We always act in charity. We always act in charity. That means we don't disown someone, but we must always encourage them to do the right thing and to pray for them. And in a very sensitive way to point out that the behavior that they are engaged in is sinful behavior, is detrimental to their immortal soul, to their salvation. Also, those persons have an obligation to respect the church's teaching, and the customs and beliefs of their natural family. In other words, you don't want to happen that someone is literally shoving it in your face, as they say, and making you and the rest of your family uncomfortable because of behaviors that you disapprove of. Now, this is extremely important. because the truth has to be spoken. We have to speak the truth. Why? Because someone's soul is at stake, and if we don't speak the truth, we could lose them and lose a number of other souls in society which are now being led astray. So let me make this analogy for you. Suppose you go to the doctor, and the doctor discovers that you have cancer. And the doctor knows that, well, this cancer, it's treatable. But, I'm not going to tell him about it because I don't want to upset him. Is that charity? No, that's not charity. Charity is when we speak the truth to help another human being to achieve their salvation. There was a famous saying in the seminary, and I never forgot it because it has stayed with me all of my life. I'll say it in Latin and then I'll translate it. Salus animarum suprema lex. Salus animarum suprema lex. The safety of souls is the highest law. God love you.